Accused South Africa of condoning genocide against white farmers. Back in March, he cut off all US assistance to the country. Today, the South African president was hoping to reset the relationship, but Donald Trump had a different plan. Weijia Jiang has more from the White House.
The meeting started with a friendly jab from President Trump.
He is a man who is certainly in some circles really respected, other circles a little bit less respected.
The lights in the conference hall dimmed without warning. Not ceremonially, not politely. They flickered the way power flickers before a blackout, the way a city breathes before a storm. Microphones died mid-sentence. Translators froze with headsets half lifted. Security personnel shifted closer to the walls, hands brushing earpieces, eyes scanning faces that suddenly looked less diplomatic and more dangerous. Whispers spread faster than language. At the center table, flags stood rigid, unmoving, like witnesses afraid to blink. The G20 emergency session was supposed to be routine, a symbolic gathering to calm markets already trembling from weeks of quiet instability. Cameras had been escorted out, doors sealed, phones surrendered. This was meant to be private. Then the South African delegate leaned forward. No theatrics, no raised voice, just one sentence, delivered evenly, into a microphone that had not yet been cut. We will no longer finance a system designed to keep us subordinate. The room inhaled sharply. Across the table, the U.S. delegation stiffened. One advisor slammed a folder shut. Another whispered something that did not sound diplomatic. The secretary's jaw tightened, eyes narrowing not in confusion, but in recognition. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a declaration. Security moved closer. The chair attempted to regain control. But the moment had already slipped beyond procedure, beyond protocol. What happened next would fracture the global order. The American response came fast and sharp, stripped of the careful language usually reserved for allies who had not yet defected. The post-war system, the secretary said, had lifted billions out of poverty. It had stabilized trade lanes, secured energy flows, prevented global war. It was imperfect, yes, but it was the only structure standing between order and chaos. South Africa listened without interruption, then replied, "You speak of order," the delegate said, "but enforce obedience. You speak of rules, but rewrite them when they inconvenience you. You speak of sovereignty, but punish those who exercise it without permission." A murmur rippled through the room. The accusation sharpened. Selective sanctions, weaponized finance, moral outrage deployed only when aligned with strategic interest. Africa had been told to liberalize, privatize, open its markets. It had complied, and yet remained perpetually emerging, forever almost equal, never enough to lead. The U.S. countered with warnings about consequences, about investor confidence, about isolation. South Africa did not blink. Instead, a document slid across the table, leaked hours earlier to a handful of journalists waiting outside. It now lay in full view of the most powerful economies on Earth. Energy agreements denominated outside the dollar. Mineral extraction partnerships with Eastern powers. Infrastructure financing routed through development banks that answered to no Western capital. And beneath it all, a quiet expansion clause. BRICS was no longer an acronym. It was becoming a bloc. Washington understood immediately. This was not defiance. This was coordination. The word sanctions hovered unspoken in the air like a threat. Everyone was tired of pretending still worked. Europe watched in silence. For a moment. Then the panic set in. Not loudly. Not publicly. It spread in glances, in scribbled notes passed under the table, in the subtle tapping of fingers against polished wood. Because Europe knew what Washington did not want to say out loud. If this escalated, markets would not wait for statements. Currencies would slide. Energy prices would spike. Supply chains already stretched thin would snap. And Europe, still bruised from years of strategic dependence, would bleed first. France whispered about autonomy. Germany calculated export exposure down to the decimal. Southern Europe worried about debt. Eastern Europe worried about security guarantees, suddenly feeling less certain. The United Kingdom, no longer bound by consensus, began making calls of its own. Europe fractured not along ideology, but along fear. And fear made one thing clear. They could not afford to choose sides. They had to intervene. Behind closed doors, the real summit began. Hotel corridors became war rooms. Elevators ferried envoys instead of guests. A senior European diplomat met a South African advisor near the emergency exit, speaking in half sentences, careful not to leave a trail. Phones lit up across time zones. Beijing answered on the second ring, Moscow on the first, Brasilia after a pause long enough to feel intentional. Intelligence agencies tracked movements not of troops, but of narratives. Which journalists were being briefed, which headlines were being drafted, which leaks were strategic, and which were accidents that could still be used. Outside, reporters sensed blood in the water. No official statements, no press briefings, just silence. And silence, in geopolitics, screams. Inside the American delegation, fault lines emerged. Some argued for pressure, maximum leverage, a show of strength to deter others watching closely from the global south. Others warned that the old playbook was exhausted, that sanctions had diminishing returns, that every threat pushed more nations toward alternatives that no longer felt theoretical. At home, Congress began to stir. Markets reacted to rumors before facts. Cable news filled the vacuum with speculation. Allies called asking questions Washington could not yet answer. Africa watched, quietly. Delegations from nations long accustomed to being spoken for, spoken about, but rarely spoken to, exchanged looks of something new. Possibility. If South Africa could do this openly, publicly at the center of the world's most exclusive economic forum, then the red lines were not as red as they once were. Messages of support arrived through back channels. Carefully worded, non-committal, but unmistakable. BRICS momentum surged not through announcements, but through alignment. Deals accelerated, meetings scheduled, contingency plans activated. The global economy did not collapse. It shuddered. Stock indices dipped, recovered, dipped again. Commodity prices spiked on speculation alone. Currency traders moved faster than diplomats, pricing in futures that assumed instability would last longer than calm. Then Europe stepped forward, not as a bloc, as a necessity. A proposal emerged late into the night, drafted by exhausted negotiators who understood that perfection was impossible and delay was dangerous. It offered no resolution, only suspension, a temporary freeze on punitive measures, a commitment to further dialogue, a working group on trade recalibration that acknowledged, without admitting fault, that the system might need adjustment. It was not peace. It was a pause. As dawn approached, signatures were prepared. Language softened. Red lines blurred just enough to allow everyone to claim restraint. Then someone leaked the draft. Not the final version. Not the polished statement. The raw text, filled with track changes and bracketed compromises, landed on screens across the world. Markets reacted instantly. Commentators dissected every clause. Accusations flew about betrayal, weakness, manipulation. Washington denied authorship. Europe blamed procedural failure. South Africa said nothing. The pause collapsed before it began. In the final session, faces were drawn. Voices low. The atmosphere thick with the understanding that something fundamental had shifted and could not be undone by wording. No joint statement was issued. No handshakes for the cameras. Delegations departed separately, security tight, schedules altered. Outside, the world argued about what it had just witnessed. Was this the beginning of the end of Western dominance, or a temporary rebellion destined to be absorbed? Was Africa finally asserting itself, or stepping into a new web of dependencies under different masters? Was Europe mediating, or simply delaying its own reckoning? The answer depended on who you asked, and that was the most dangerous part. Because for the first time in decades, there was no single voice loud enough to settle the debate. Only competing visions, colliding in real time. As the lights dimmed again in the now empty hall, one question lingered, unanswered, echoing far beyond the summit walls. If the old order can no longer command obedience, what replaces it? And who gets to decide?